Thanks for joining us today on Voices of Empowerment. I'm Annie, and today I'll be picking Julia's brain about resources and support methods for domestic violence victims. What are the typical cycles or stages of domestic violence?
This is an important question because I think the cycle of violence makes parts of abusive relationships that I think are typically really confusing for people not experiencing them or who are not savvy to DV dynamics a little bit more understandable. The cycle will sort of speak to how an abusive relationship can have both really bad parts and also really good parts, which contribute to things like survivors oftentimes leaving and going back and leaving and going back and leaving and going back, typically an average of about 7 or 8 times. It also really contributes to secondary survivors, people who are on the receiving end of disclosures, to make sense of, I don't understand why somebody would go back when somebody has been so terrible to them. And if that's really the case, how bad is this, right? If somebody is going back or if somebody is staying. So there's the honeymoon phase, and then something changes arbitrarily in an abusive relationship and tension starts to build. And the tension builds until ultimately the tension is broken by an abusive incident. So I do this kind of for dramatic effect, but an incident here could be any one of those 5 different types of abusive behavior, followed quickly thereafter by another round of the honeymoon phase. And the cycle of violence tends to go around and around and around and around like this. Some couples will cycle through this in a matter of days or weeks, and others, it could take years.
Why do you think that it is important to talk about domestic violence in our community?
How much time do we have? I'm just
I
kidding.
know. Because I think it's like
But-
way more common than we probably think, right?
Yeah.
And if we're not talking about it, how do we know?
So based on reported numbers, and I think we've already established that lots of people don't report, lots of people don't disclose. Based on reported numbers, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men will experience some form of domestic violence at some point in their lifetime. That number is actually way higher than 1 in 4, 1 in 7. Again, that's based on reported statistics only from local law enforcement, prosecutor's office, etc. I think domestic violence is so important to talk about because it impacts so many people. There are so many hidden costs, financial and otherwise, when it comes to abusive relationships. The impact on survivors, certainly, their children, their family, their friends, our healthcare system. And, this is a very cliche way to say this, but it's absolutely true, that violence thrives in silence. So I am absolutely the person in my office and also out on the street. If I see something, I say something. It is important to make this stuff talk aboutable, is what I say in sessions with my clients.
What is some advice that you would give someone who is currently feeling trapped in an abusive situation?
If and when and how it feels right and safe for you to get some starting information, start with that. Sometimes that'll be a disclosure to a neighbor. Other times that'll be, again, a safe Google search at home, meaning if you have reason to suspect that your partner, or if has cameras throughout the house or is monitoring your search history, your browser history, that's something to pay attention to. If it's calling a hotline number, a local hotline, a national hotline, if that's sending an email to me through my website, starting with knowing what your rights are, knowing what your options are, whether or not you choose to stay or leave now or at some point in the future. It's important to know that support is available to you no matter where you are in the process or what kinds of experiences you may be having in your intimate relationship.
Last, I just want to know how we can encourage open conversations about these issues without the abused feeling shame.
Those of us who are on the receiving end of this information, how we are responding to disclosures. How are we making survivors feel? How are we making people, let's say that we're not even talking about domestic violence, somebody's not disclosing to us, but we're sitting around a table with girlfriends at brunch and the topic of DV comes up. How do you talk about it? Do you talk about it? Do you engage in a conversation about that? Do you engage in such a way that could make somebody who has not yet disclosed at that table of friends that they are experiencing domestic violence or that they have experienced domestic violence? It's important to think that when these opportunities arise, when you're hearing these kinds of things, when you're seeing them on TV or in the movies, there are two paths, right? Paths that, in terms of response, that elicit more. Tell me about that. I believe you. I take this seriously. Domestic violence is never a victim's fault.
Well, you think it may not be happening in your group of people at your brunch table, people you would, socialize with. You don't know
Right.
when it's happening. It was like the first series where we talked about the face in public and the face behind closed doors. It's the same thing. Well, you may sit at a group of women at a brunch and someone brings up domestic violence, it comes up and it's not in our circle and it could never happen to us. It's
Right.
not that. It's more of well, it can happen. It happens here in Bergen County. It's more common than you think. It's the openness to the conversation that I think is so crucial and so important. If the topic of domestic violence is coming up at your brunch table, it's not by accident. Thank you to Julia for all of your expert advice and insights surrounding domestic violence. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and now YouTube. Thank you for tuning in again. If you or someone you know is in danger, call your local emergency service or find help at thehotline.org. We hope you found Voices of Empowerment useful and educational, as it's a topic that affects millions of people worldwide. If you have more topics you'd like to hear about, comment below.